Module 8 is a continuation of the discussion about chart reporting. And since this course is about visualizing data, and charts are really the mainstream way that we visualize data with reporting services, this is our introduction to visualizing. We're going to go a little deeper now on the topic of advanced and complex chart capabilities. I'll start by talking about multi-series, multi-axis, and multi-area charts. And this is a way that we can visualize multiple measures and multiple numeric values within a single chart using different scales and along the same groupings. I'll demonstrate designing a multi-series, multi-axis chart. And then we'll talk about multi-area charts, which is a technique and a capability within the reporting services charting component to actually create multiple charts using a single chart component based on the same data set and similar groupings and access properties. I'll demonstrate designing a multi-area chart, and then we'll talk about some specialized chart types. These are charts that are designed for very specific use cases. And we'll talk about what those use cases are, and then I'll demonstrate creating a complex and specialized chart. A little bit of review. I showed you the graphic on the left in the last module and talked about how all of the objects that comprise charts and reporting services are organized into a hierarchy, and understanding these objects at a high level will help you better understand how to get a lot of use out of charts. So we're going to look at some specific object collections now. So we're going to start with the series value. This was really kind of the fundamental concept within charts, where we're aggregating some kind of numeric value across a category of some kind, and then optionally across a series group. So in this chart, I have two series values, and one is visualized using a column, and the other is visualized using a line. So these are two different measures, two different numeric columns in the same data set, sales amount and order quantity, that are grouped across a group category, in this case using year and then month. Now, in order to facilitate this grouping and aggregation and visualize all of this, we use what are called axes. So there are horizontal and vertical axes that correspond to the category group, what we call the category axis, and the series value, which are called the value axis. Now you'll see that in this example of a horizontally oriented chart, i.e. column chart and line chart, that the vertical axes are the numeric scales and the horizontal axis is the categorization buckets, the calendar year and the month in this example. We're going to look at that in greater detail, and then later on we'll talk about the chart area. Multi-series chart compatibility. We can use different chart types to represent different series values within the same chart, but there are some compatibility limitations. Each series value may be a different chart type, but the chart types must share the same category group, series group, and access properties in order to be compatible. Here are some examples. All of these chart types are horizontally oriented. What that means is that the category group is organized along the horizontal axis, and then the height of the columns or the height of the line or the area is relative to the aggregate value of the series values. And so we can combine any of these. We couldn't combine any of these with incompatible chart types. All of the chart types must be on the same vertical or horizontal orientation. So for example, a column chart could not be combined with a bar chart. Typically, when you create multi-axis, multi-series charts with different chart types, you're always going to use these horizontally oriented chart types. Multi-axis charts can have a primary or a secondary axis on both the vertical scale and the horizontal scale. Now, I have two examples here. Horizontally oriented charts are on the left. These are two line charts in this example, but they could be columns or areas. Over on the right, I have a vertically oriented chart. This example is a bar chart with two different series values. Now, referring to the bullet items on the left side, the vertical axes of a horizontally oriented chart are always going to be the numeric scale of the series value. So the primary axis is the axis that you see on the left side. That is enabled by default when you create a chart. The secondary axis of a horizontally oriented chart or a vertically oriented chart is the scale on the right side. Again, the difference is exactly the same as before, that for a horizontally oriented chart, it's the series value numeric scale, where with a vertically oriented chart, it's going to be the category group labeling. Horizontal axis, same thing. The primary axis is at the bottom of the chart. That's what you get by default, and that's probably the most common use. However, we can also have a secondary axis. Now, you can use one or the other, or you can use both, and it only makes sense to use both when typically when you actually have two different series values that have different scales. These are set in the series properties dialog. So when you right-click on the series properties, there are actually a few different ways to get to this dialog. Here you see on the axis and chart area page, here are the vertical axis properties where you can enable either the primary or secondary axis, and then the horizontal axis, primary or secondary. Again, one is assigned per series value, but you can have multiple series values within the same chart with different primary or secondary axis assignments. Well, this is a version of an earlier report I had created. You'll recall that I started out with two tables, and we then created a chart from the total excluding tax across months, and then I also created the total excluding tax across sales buying groups for this chart here. And I've since changed this to a line chart because it was a continuous time series. Now, I have also created a similar chart over here, also grouped by month. Quantity is my series value. Now, these are all based on the same data set. Now, the first thing that I want to do, just to mix things up a little bit, is to use a different visual. I think that the column chart is actually a good visual. If my purpose is to compare these values, if I have labels on them, then I can use something like a pie chart or a ring chart or donut chart so that the user does see the specific values. They also get a sense of comparison. The column chart or bar chart is a better visual for comparing things side by side than a circular type of chart. But the circular charts, which I'll go ahead and just go and convert this to let's use a donut chart, often called a ring chart in other tools like Power BI. We call it a donut chart here. So you'll see that this visual does a good job of showing us the proportion of values, but it doesn't really accentuate that this value is smaller than this value, and this value is larger than this value. So we have to rely on the labeling to do that. We also have a little bit of a challenge here where this is a dark ring and we have dark text over the top of it. So we could vary the text, but you can imagine if I made this white, then we wouldn't see any of the text that's outside. So, maybe yellow text would be more appropriate. So dealing with colors and dealing with circular types of charts is always going to be one of those balancing acts. And there are some experts in the industry who kind of go to extremes and will tell you never to use these. But fact of the matter is that the donut and ring charts are popular and they do serve a purpose. It's just a question of whether it meets your needs and whether you're within the confines of a visual that is useful that way. Now, let's move this one out of the way, and I'm just going to deal with the other two charts now. So, I've visualized data from the same data set, essentially two different numeric measures into two different charts. That takes up space, but it does make it very clear that these are two different values, even though they're very similar to each other as we show them in this time series across months. But we can combine them together, and I'm going to go to this chart, and I'll go ahead and add the quantity, and that just shows up as another line. And you'll see that my sales amount and my quantity cannot be measured on the same axis scale. One, the numbers are different, and two, they're different things. This is supposed to be currency. Quantity is not currency. Quantity are units. So to facilitate that, I need to add a secondary axis. So I'll go back to the chart. I'll go to the properties of the quantity series value. And here on the axis and chart area, I'm going to put this on my secondary vertical axis. Let me move this window out of the way so you can see what happens. This is my primary vertical axis on the left side. The secondary vertical axis is on the right side. In a chart that displays values from left to right, like a column chart, line chart, or area chart, primary is left, secondary is right. So let's go ahead and view that. So this is accurate. You can see that my grid lines are duplicated. Now, there are lots of little changes that I can make here. It's not obvious to me that grid line and that grid line belong to the secondary axis, and this grid line, other than that it lines up with the $5 million here, that belongs to the left side. So I could change the color, I could change the line type using dashed or dotted lines. There are a lot of little tweaks and changes I could make, and those are the kinds of things that typically are the time-consuming part about dashboard and chart report design, or just the little tweaks. And you want to get feedback from your stakeholders and users. You'll become very familiar with the data as you're designing these things, and you need to get someone with an objective view who can look at it and say, wait, I don't understand what this line means, or I don't understand that this goes with that, etc. But this is accurate. The problem now is that it's just not obvious that they're two different things, that the teal line is the total excluding tax and it belongs to this series, and the dark line belongs to this series over here as millions of units. I don't like the millions. I mentioned that earlier, so I'm actually going to change this scale. I think this is a minor point, but we'll change that to thousands, and I'll change the axis title. Okay, and visually, the only thing that changed were the numbers here. I could probably drop the decimals just as I could drop the decimals over here as well. This is definitely kind of an evolutionary cycle of design, as you can see. But what I want to do is separate visually these two lines. And to do that, I'm actually going to change the chart type. So I will go back to total excluding tax, right click on that. I'll change the chart type back to a column. I had mentioned earlier that column charts are very appropriately used as time series, though the data doesn't necessarily continually flow from one element to another. Users are accustomed to seeing column charts used for time series. I'm going to change the border thickness. Just to mix things up, I'll use the properties window to do that. So I will change the border width. Let me resize this so that we can see that. Change the border width. I can just type in this window, or I can use the drop down. Change that to 2 points. Then I'll change the color to be blue. And I want my markers to be blue as well. So that's the border color. Also change that to blue. If I had chosen a line with markers, then that would change those markers as well. So let's take a look at that. Okay, I like that chart. Some other minor things that I could do is I could actually change the color of this text to match the chart itself. And if I were to do that, then I would want to explicitly change the color of my columns. And but I'm going to go ahead and delete this chart, and then I can pull this chart back up, creating more of a simple dashboard style report. And I'm very happy with those charts. We'll talk about specialized and special purpose charts now. When you add a chart to a report, the Add Chart dialog will show you a number of common and unique charts. This is a sampling of some of the more unique charts that are presented on that menu. And there are a couple of new charts. We'll talk about these here briefly. The tree map and the sunburst chart were new additions in 2016. And then there are a number of very special purpose charts that are called out here. Specialized charts are typically suited for either special data sets or special use cases. And these are a few that we might think about. Industry-specific norms. A couple of examples of these are the funnel chart that you see on the shape row on the top, and the pyramid chart that you see on the left side of the second row. The funnel chart is commonly used in customer relationship management applications. And consumers of those applications, people who work in that industry, are accustomed to seeing what they call the customer pipeline or the lead pipeline visualized in a funnel chart. It's not that the visual is specifically suited for that type of data. It's that within that industry, people are accustomed to using this particular visualization, and it works for them. Think about how a pyramid might be used for a fundraising campaign. Again, it's something that people are accustomed to seeing. It's a norm within that industry and a visualization that resonates with particular users. Specialized data sets might include, in addition to aggregate values that are categorized, may include a starting range and an ending range, like a time series or a low value and a high value. And therefore, it might make sense to use a range visualization like the area range or the vertical or horizontal Gantt style charts that you see in the range category. Statistical results might be best visualized within some of the chart types that you see there to the right. The stock, the candlestick, and the box plot charts are specifically suited for statistical and scientific results, where we have median, we have percentile values. So think of a particular category that might have a first, second, third, and fourth percentile sampling of student grades or of number of patients with a certain diagnosis, that kind of thing where there's a lot of heavy statistics used. A multi-measure correlation where we're measuring more than one thing, maybe two or three different things that can be plotted on an X and a Y scale. A scatter plot or a bubble chart might be an appropriate way to visualize that data. I mentioned statistical results for scientific research. Those are related topics. And then there are outlier cases that may call for very specific and special purpose charts. The last category shown here, the polar charts, though do have purpose in very specific use cases, are often misused just because they're unique. And so I think a point to be made here is avoid using unique chart visualizations just because they're there. Don't use a lot of different charts just for variety's sake. Use the right visual to communicate and express the presentation of that data in the correct form, and make sure that the chart that you use is best suited for your data. It's better to have a dashboard of column charts and line charts than it is to have a bunch of polar charts and scatter plots that don't make any sense and don't communicate the message very well. New charts introduced in SQL Server 2016 include the tree map. This is a very simple chart. The tree map chart draws square or rectangle shapes, the size of which is the aggregate value across the series axis, and then the color is relative to the category axis. And so there's a two-level hierarchy between those two groupings. The sunburst chart is actually very similar because it visualizes the same type of data. Again, two different levels where we have color that is akin to the category axis, and then we can have multiple levels of groups within the series axis that will create this ring effect. One thing to keep in mind when using specialized charts is that there are a number of very specific properties that are suited for that chart type. I wanted to share some of these with you. I'm going to demonstrate one of these special case charts, but just know that there are a number of charts that we could spend an enormous amount of time talking about specific properties and talking about the way that each of them are used. But using the box plot chart as an example, when I add a field to the series values, you can see that I'm actually prompted for a number of different properties. Now, some of these are optional, but in the case of the box plot, which again, I'm just using as an example, think about that box plot typically used for a percentile or quartile visualization across different categories. We would typically have at least 4 different values. There would be a high whisker, a low whisker, a high box, and a low box to be able to show first, second, third, and fourth quartile aggregations across maybe a particular product category or sales region or salesperson, and show a statistical sampling of all of the products that are manufactured, or all the products that are sold, or all of the patients that are diagnosed, or all of the students that go to a school. Now then, there are some optional fields here, like in this case, the mean and the median are both optional fields. A point here is that Reporting Services doesn't perform these calculations for you. You have to have a query, a data set that returns these values, and then you simply map them to these different fields. Let's use a slightly simpler example. This is a bubble chart. Bubble charts are commonly used when we have multiple measures that have some kind of a correlation. It could be something as simple as the quantity of units sold against the total sales amount. And those two different values would be plotted on the x-axis and the y-axis, and then the size of the bubble might be perhaps the profit. So when you have multiple related measure values, consider using one of these specialized chart types. Otherwise, typically you want to use standard charts like column charts, bar charts, line and area charts. We'll take a look at a use case for the bubble chart in the demonstration coming up. To demonstrate the capabilities of chart areas, I'm actually going to start with a fairly extreme example just to show you the capabilities of this feature. And then we'll take a look at a more practical example that you'll repeat in the lab exercise. I've created a chart with several series values. Now, in practice, these would typically be different numeric columns from the same data set. Some of them are actually the same as others just for demonstration purposes. You can see that everything is going to be grouped by month on the category groups, and that these are all smooth line chart types right now. But each of these could actually be different chart types. So using all of the compatible chart types, I could change one to a column, I could change one to a straight line chart. I could change another to a banded area chart. So you should get the idea that I can mix and match quite a bit. So you can overlay different chart types. Now I've worked on projects where an entire dashboard report was based on one or just a few charts, and we've literally spent weeks to months making changes, tweaking, and fine-tuning these things to get them in front of executive level users within the organization. So you can spend a lot of time just working on one or a few charts. Now that I've changed the chart types a few times, I can actually add multiple areas to my chart. So far we've been working within different axes and series within the same chart area, but if I click outside of the chart area here, let's go here, you can see that I can add a new chart area, and that actually adds another rectangular area within the same chart. Now I rarely will build charts that have more than 2 areas, but for demonstration purposes I'm going to create several chart areas. You'll see that the designer's pretty smart about how it arranges these. I'm going to add 5 additional areas, which means that we actually have 6. Now you have to actually click in this empty space to see where each of these areas are. And these are named, this is the default area, this is area 1, this is area 2, area 3, area 4, area 5, etc. Now, when I go to each of my series values, within the properties, if I go to the axis and chart area page, I can assign this a chart area. So I'm just going to assign each of my different areas So this actually creates essentially separate copies of the same chart, but it uses the same vertical and horizontal axis scales. So rather than having to create individual charts and get them all lined up and make sure that all of the properties are the same, this is a convenient way to create multiple charts that share the same axis and scale characteristics. And then I also have the option of using either the primary or secondary vertical axis or horizontal axis. And then let's go ahead and just preview that report so you can see what those charts look like. Let's go ahead and zoom in. So again, with very little effort, I was able to visualize a lot of corresponding information using different multiples or different chart areas. You'll recall from earlier that I had created a single chart with 2 series values, and because there were 2 different chart types and 2 different measurements, I used both the primary and secondary vertical axis to separate them. Now, what I would like to do is, first of all, let's go ahead and run that chart just so we can be reminded what it looks like. Note that the months appear this way in a wider chart, which makes them a little easier to read. I'm going to go back to Design View, and I'm going to add another chart area. Now, charts can get a little tricky because there's so many different objects. One trick in design is that if you show the Properties window, the selected object will be noted up here in the heading. That's particularly useful when you're selecting things in a chart. So you can see that there's my chart. There's my axis title. There's my chart area, which is called default. Anyway, it's useful to be able to see which objects you have selected. I'm going to go back and choose that chart area. I need to right click outside of the chart area on the background of the chart to add a new chart area. Now I need to create some more vertical space, so I'll go ahead and drag that down. You can see my new chart area right there. I'll go to the quantity series value, left click to drop down the menu, and go to the series properties, and here I'll move this to the new chart area that I had created called Chart 1 and click OK. Now when you do that, you'll notice that the report makes room for the axis over on the left side and moves the chart over. Here it moves the chart over to the left to make room for the secondary axis, which means that my months don't line up now. Let's go ahead and run that so we can see that. Yeah, so that doesn't meet my needs because they're not aligned. So the first thing that I want to do is I'm actually going to rotate those months. I'll go to the horizontal axis properties, go to labels. You can see it's set to auto fit right now. I'm going to disable auto fit and rotate the labels 90 degrees. Now you notice that these axis properties are separate. And that would be a little confusing, but you can see that here the month labels are horizontal and here they're rotated. Now I'm not actually going to change that because I'm not actually going to use these. So what I want to do is go back to my quantity series value, to the series properties, axis and chart area, and I'm going to go ahead and just use the primary vertical axis. So now I have both my currency scale for the total excluding tax and the units over on the left side. But you also see that this scale, the axis properties inherited the properties from this one. So that's just an anomaly I need to take care of. I'm going to right click, go to vertical axis properties, and I'll format that as a number, and I'm going to show this as thousands. I'll change the axis title, and I'll say 1,000. I'm going to say units, just to remind the user what they're looking at. Let's double check that. So I can see that the columns line up with the labels now on both chart areas, which I like. And now there's no need to have labels for both of these. So I'm actually just going to select that axis and delete it. That's a chart that I like. So I have an axis scale that relates to the column chart. Here I have an axis scale that relates to the line chart. I may need to resize that a little bit or maybe abbreviate that axis title, but that works. And my columns and line markers line up with the months. And that's a very effective chart. Using a bubble chart in this demonstration, we'll analyze the correlation between the aggregate sales quantity, sales total excluding tax, and the month. So I'll start. As you can see, I have a data set, much like the data sets I've been using for demonstrations, where we have aggregate quantity and sales total excluding tax across calendar month. This takes a calendar year as a parameter, and we're always going to be looking at 1 year at a time. And then we have the month number, so there may be up to 12 months for a particular year. And then we're also grouping by the product category. So I'm going to insert a chart. I'll place that chart right here. I'm going to choose a bubble chart. And I'll go ahead and resize the chart. I'll click once, that'll show the chart data. Now for the category groups, I'm going to put the month number on the category groups. Let's try that again. Drag and drop that there. I will add the category as the series group. Now watch as I add the sales quantity. Because this is a bubble chart, when I let go, it's going to prompt me for 3 different fields. That's because the bubble chart has the capacity to plot measure values across the y-axis. So by default, the sum of the sales quantity is the y value, which is plotted across the y-axis. Here, the vertical axis. The x value, where whatever field there is going to be, that aggregate value will be plotted against the horizontal or x value. and then optionally the size. Now, I only have 2 measure values here, so we're not going to vary the size. You could argue that this would be the same as a scatter plot. Typically, we think of a scatter plot or a scatter chart as having a lot of data points. This isn't going to have a lot of data points, and the bubbles will be relatively large. So it's just a bubble chart with the same size bubbles. And so I'm going to go ahead and add the sales total excluding tax to the X value. So let's take a look at this in preview. So we're already seeing, based on the legend here, that for each product category, for example, shirts, we can see that the sales for shirts have changed in, and of course I need to remember these until I label them, where the total sales amount has varied as it's moved from left to right, and the quantity has also varied as it moves bottom to top. Now, without having either labels or tooltips on these bubbles, I don't know what months these represent. And I also have so many months that I really can't see which is which. So for that reason, I've actually created a multi-select parameter for the month, so I can just choose a few months at a time. Now, let me switch to a formatted version of the same chart, which I happen to have already prepared on this report. I'll just drag that up and place it right there. So now we're essentially looking at the same data. I've added tooltips so we can see the month of the year, and I can see the quantity and the total amount. Now to simplify this, I'll go ahead and just choose a few months at a time. I'll choose January, February, and March. All right, so now I can actually see, and let's go ahead and take a look at Right On Toys. If I hover over this bubble, this tells me that in January we had a quantity of 1282 and a total sales amount of about $334,000. And then you can see that actually this is not a linear progression. So we actually moved from this bubble to this bubble. This is our February amount, where the total amount was 363 and change, and then moved back in the middle. So this gives us a good analysis. It would allow a user who's willing to take the time to investigate the data and look at it deeper to understand trends and see how different things have influenced these numbers. And of course, we can also see how different product categories compare in terms of both quantity of sales, where shirts are the highest, versus the total sales amount, where shirts are also highest. But we can see that Right On Toys have a larger sales amount but a lower quantity. This is a good chart for analysis. It's not necessarily a good chart for dashboard style quick at a glance reading of data.